In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and Europe was at war again. It would test the will of the free world to stand up against advancing German armies. It took them 5 years of unprecedented bloodshed, but they eventually defeated Hitler and the German army. In the wake of this destruction, there were millions of dead people and mass chaos. Today, we'll look at the European theater of World War II. Before examining the particulars of the war, we have to understand Hitler's viewpoint. He believed in a supreme Aryan race that was meant to expand, and in order to expand, it needed Lebensraum, or living space. And particularly looked to the east to move the Slavic and Jewish people out of the east and to create the space for the Aryans to grow and prosper. He had a particular dislike of Russia and its communistic beliefs, which he thought was Jewish in origin. So he wanted the space to grow and to expand, and he had a very deliberate plan for world conquest and for the growth of German power. And unlike World War I, which was more an accidental war, World War II was very deliberate on the German part. Before the actual invasion of Poland, there was a lot of movement towards war. First, they violated the Versailles Treaty and started to rearm, increasing the size of the army, building an air force. Then they reoccupied the Rhineland, which was supposed to be a territory that was supposed to be demilitarized. Next, the Germans stepped in the Spanish Civil War, which was kind of a dress rehearsal for World War II, and helped the fascist leader Franco come into power. Then they pushed an Anschluss with Austria, that is, the Austrian state merged with the German state, creating one pan-Germanic state. Next, they set their eyes on the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, a part of Czechoslovakia that was occupied by a lot of Germans, and he believed that they should be living in Germany. And the international leaders agreed to it. All of these things were illegal and broke international law, yet the community did nothing to stop it. The League of Nations did nothing to stop it. This policy is called appeasement, the fact that they would give Hitler what he wanted in order to avoid war. People were very weary of war as a result of World War I, and therefore they did everything in their power to stop another war from happening. And particularly, we look at the Munich Agreement, which allowed Hitler control of Czechoslovakia. And this particular movement is when France and Britain were perhaps at its lowest in September 1938, when they agreed to surrender the Sudetenland to the Czechs. Ironically, Neville Chamberlain returned back to Britain, saying, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, the British Prime Minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our times." They were sadly mistaken. Hitler next set his eyes on Poland, which again, the part bordering Germany, had a lot of native Germans in it, and he said he wanted that part as well. Finally, the Western leaders found a backbone and said, "You cannot have it." In order to fight a complex war, Hitler and Stalin signed the Non-Aggression Compact, basically dividing Poland into separate spheres. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France declared war against Germany, and we have the beginning of World War II. Very initial stages, Germany was very successful. They launched Blitzkrieg, which was a lightning attack. They used speed and complete mechanized units and panzer divisions made up of 300 tanks and airplanes that would break through the enemy lines. Which you would see in World War I, the old trenches where Mostar was kind of crushed by these mechanized units and these airplanes, and then they would surround turn the flank and surround the army and force them to surrender. So it led to very speedy attacks. Poland, which also was attacked from in the east from the Soviet Union, was defeated within a month. After Poland, they entered kind of a phony war through the winter of 39 and early spring of 1940. But once the weather warmed, Western Europe was attacked in 1940. Denmark fell in a day. Norway fell in weeks. Belgium and the Netherlands fell very quickly. And by June 22nd, Paris falls, and France surrenders. The Germans were unstoppable. They set their eyes now on Britain, and the poor war situation meant that there was a change of government. The Chamberlain was out, and Winston Churchill, a great prime minister, was put in his place. Then the Battle of Britain raged. It was an air campaign, which would allow for a potential invasion of Britain. If they controlled the skies, then the Germans would be able to make the trip across the English Channel and launch a land invasion. But if they did not control the skies, that kind of water crossing would be impossible. So at first they start bombing tactically bases and so forth, and then they switch to saturation bombing of cities. They bombed London and targeted civilians as well. And Britain was able to withstand this Luftwaffe attack, which launched in August of 1940. And by the end of the fall, around October, Britain was pretty successful. The Royal Air Force and the use of radar was able to inflict enough damages on the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, that they called off the campaign. And thus, the German advance was stalled in a certain degree in the West. Britain was saved, though the rest of Western continental Europe had fallen. The next year, with France out, Germany launches its main offensive of the war, Operation Barbarossa. It's 1941 invasion of Russia. This might be one of the largest land invasions in all of history. It was across almost a 2,000-mile front. Over 3 million German soldiers launched this invasion. And they were very successful at first, causing millions of Soviet troops to surrender. They had an army group north going towards Leningrad, a central group going into Moscow, and a southern group going down to the Black Sea region where there was a lot of oil. But unfortunately for the Germans, they did not plan for a long war. The winter sets in, the resistance stiffens, and they stall about 25 miles outside of Moscow. There was a huge battle, Stalingrad, which was typified this really harsh fighting. And by 1943, 2 years in, 300,000 Germans are encircled and forced to surrender. So this was the key turning point in this war, the stalling of the German advance in the winter of 1941, which pretty much marked the end of Hitler's grand plans. And from then on, he was on the defensive. As you can see, this is the German Empire at its height. The gray territories had kind of been incorporated into the German Empire. The blue is the ally of Germany, Italy, and the two enemies are Britain and Russia. You can see that dotted line is how far they've made their way through Russia. But for the most part, the continent of Europe had been pretty much taken over by the Nazis and the Italians. The Americans entered the war in the winter of 1941 after the invasion of Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. And they want to start a second front, and they decide to do this in the soft underbelly of Italy. So they attack North Africa first. And they have an Allied victory. They attack from Morocco and Algeria. The British push from Egypt, and there's great tank battles. But eventually the Germans surrender in May 1934. All of North Africa is then under Allied control, and then they move to open a second front in Italy from Tunisia, then going to Sicily, and then the mainland. So they invade Sicily in July 1943, a great amphibious landing, setting up perhaps a dress rehearsal for D-Day. 250,000 troops attack Sicily, and there's a victory by August, about 1 month later. At this point, the Italians remove Mussolini from power, and fearing that their only ally in Europe, only major ally in Europe, would fall, the Germans invade Italy and prop up the state and bring Mussolini back to power. At this point, the Allies decide to invade the mainland. And it's very slow and difficult going, but they capture Rome in June of 1944. Also in June, they open up a second front in the northern part of Europe. This is Operation Overlord, or also known more famously as D-Day. June 6, 1944, the Allies cross the English Channel and attack France. The main force was 4,000 ships, 150,000 soldiers, supported by naval and air bombardments. Some of this resulted in huge problems and great casualties. The naval and air bombardments were ineffective on some of the beaches. In Omaha Beach, for example, there was 3,000 casualties within the first few hours. But in all, there was a huge Allied victory, and they were able to establish a beachhead. Within 2 weeks, there was 1 million Allied soldiers, 500,000 tons of supplies, and almost 200,000 vehicles. Paris falls within 2 months. In late August 1944, they have recontrolled the capital of France. Again, at this point, the Rome falling, Paris falling, and the Russians moving in from the east, the German leadership knows that the war is coming to an end, and not for the good side for them. They fight almost one more suicidal battle, the Battle of the Bulge, in the winter of 1944-1945. A counteroffensive by the Germans in France, but it really exhausts the German reserves. Basically, you're looking at young boys and old men fighting. The Russians start making advancements in the east. They capture Warsaw in January 1945, the center of the Polish state. Vienna falls in April 1913, 1945. Now the Allies had kind of converged, and they start making their way within Germany proper. Cologne, the first major city in Western Germany, falls in March. They start firebombing Dresden and Berlin and all the major cities, destroying their ability to produce any type of war armaments. Finally, there's one huge push for Berlin. The Russians make it there first. They capture Berlin. Hitler, a few days prior, commits a suicide in his bunker, and his body is burnt. And then the few Nazis that are left for unconditional surrender on May 7th, 1945. The war is over. One of the horrible things that they discover is that Hitler had killed millions of people, and particularly the Jewish population. He first rounded up the Jews and put them into ghettos. In all the major cities that are under the German occupation. And then when he invaded Russia, they moved to more direct killings, rounding up the Jews in any Russian-held territories and shooting them by firing squads. And then finally, when they realized the war effort was coming to an end and they might lose, they started the death camps. They built several death camps, including Auschwitz, Birkenau, in Poland, and they started moving the Jews by train to these death camps where they were gassed and then cremated. In all, maybe close to 6 million Jews died, and probably another 6 million other people that were also enemies of the Nazi state.